The release of the latest special effects epic heralds a new dawn in filmmaking. There is a revolution sweeping through Hollywood as the boundaries of art and science are blurred. The result is the birth of a new star, the computer-generated actor.
We're at a time of a field being invented. And every once in a while you see that in different fields in history. There was a time in physics or in chemistry where the concepts dramatically changed and the world changed. And that's where we are right now.
In 1912, the Titanic represented the technological zenith of the industrial age. 85 years later, James Cameron's Titanic marks the culmination of effects technology in film.
Hey, Rob.
This apparent perfection of visual effects has been made possible by the computer.
The goal now in these particular types of films like Titanic is that you don't really want to be seen as an effect because it pulls you out of the movie. It's well, that was a fake shot or that was a trick, so you don't believe the scene that's taking place. So the idea that you could do a shot and do it with such subtlety that the audience is not aware that a trick was done will make you believe the story more, and that's ultimately the goal, especially in films like these where you don't want to show the spectacle of a special effect. You want to show the spectacle of a grand boat at sea.
These are problems that filmmakers have wrestled with since the turn of the century. The Battle of Manila Bay may look primitive by today's standards, but at the time, the original film footage was presented as actuality newsreel. Cinema has its origins in the motion studies of Edward Muybridge. He triggered a series of stills cameras in sequence to produce a succession of pictures. These sequences of still pictures hinted at the possibility of cinema and highlighted some of the principles of perception.
There are two characteristics which are terribly important in allowing us to see movies. The first is the way in which we extract motion information has evolved, obviously, that we have mechanisms which detect the continuous motion of objects in our surroundings. Now, the particular ways in which we extract motion are such that they're relatively tolerant, and therefore we can fool the motion system, not necessarily by having continuous motion, but by having a series of discrete pictures, and that's, of course, how a movie film is constructed. There's a second characteristic that's also needed, and that is that our visual systems are, in general, insensitive to the rapid flickering of lights. In the movies, we project pictures at a rate of 50 pictures or more per second, and therefore we don't notice the flicker. Of course, some of the early movies this wasn't true, and that's of course why the movies were referred to as the flicks.
The earliest films were treated as little more than sideshows, designed to amaze the public with theatrical illusions and camera tricks.
I think although you could argue in principle that really there was nothing new in the field of traditional effects, if I can call them that, after about 1910, nevertheless, what we're talking about is an increasing sophistication on the part of the viewer who wanted to see something better all the time.
As film made the transition into narrative, there was a need for effects to appear real. Illusions had to be increasingly hidden from the audience. A demand for the spectacular culminated with the silent epics of DeMille, the special effects master of his day. However basic, all effects rely on the way in which our visual system works.
People sometimes think of vision as resembling a movie camera. There's a lens, and it casts an image on the light-sensitive film, which would be analogous to your retina. But in fact, vision is completely different because there's a great deal of active processing going on in the brain, even when you're looking at the simplest visual scene. When you look at the visual scene, you see a single picture. In fact, there are many attributes to the scene. There is form or shape, there's color, there's the relative depth or distances between objects, and then there's the fact that things may be moving or stationary. It's now becoming more and more obvious that in the brains of primates, including us humans, we have separate parts of the brain specialized for these different attributes. Now, people generally think of visual illusions as curiosities, which you use to titillate the senses. But in fact, they're much more than that. They're illustrating very important principles underlying the functional organization of the visual system.
Exploiting the peculiarities of our visual system is the key to the success of special effects.
Okay, are you ready to go? Ready.
Okay, rehearsal's up. Let's start the wind, please. And action.
On set with the Titanic, James Cameron is in the process of shooting his most ambitious venture yet, a major effects shot that will push current technology to its limits.
This film started in its inception with a trip to the real Titanic, and everything after that had to come up to that level, of realism and dedication and passion. You go through this little tiny hatch and you get into this thing and they bolt it closed and you're down for anywhere from 12 to, our longest dive was 17 and a half hours. And you're freezing, you're cramped in this little tiny space, and you're looking out through a little plexiglass window. It was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. But the fact that we were able to come back with this quite a rich harvest of film images and video images from inside the ship, and we literally saw things that no one has seen since 1912, since that ship went down. We went inside and explored the inside. So then we've integrated that into the fabric of the film that we're making.
Cameron was obsessed that any computer special effects should match the footage he had already shot of the real Titanic. Building a full-size ship and sinking it in the Atlantic was rejected because of time constraints. Instead, he opted to build a near full-size mock-up that would never leave the dock. For shots where the ship is required to appear at sea, a smaller version was needed. Cameron's fixation with realism meant 100,000 rivets had to be painstakingly applied by hand. Nice work if you can get it.
The way traditional shots have been done is that you end up building as large a ship as you can make and try to have it interact with the sea as if it were a full-size boat. The problems with that are, to make the ship look like it's correct, you have to overcrank the camera, slow up the camera, which slows up the water, and that's usually a telltale sign that it's a miniature shot. Also, the camera's always far back enough to not really detect that much movement on the ship.
The use of miniatures and models has been a mainstay of the special effects supervisors.
You could say that we're in the business of deception, that we actually do an awful lot of cheating. And because we, the viewer, only sees what we record in the camera, one of the things that we can do, for example, is instead of building a wonderful futuristic city, we can actually do it on a scale model. And if we have the camera pointed appropriately and set up appropriately, it's perfectly believable. However, it becomes very, very quickly apparent that that model is a model unless we can combine it with some live action. The cinematographer in those days had to figure out a way to make it seem more believable. And one of the ways that he could do that was either by moving the camera along the model and then including, with the appropriate perspective, some live actors in the scene, and immediately we were cheating the audience again. They could actually believe it, and we had improved the scene enormously. The next big step forward in sophistication was the optical printer, which basically allowed us to take two scenes that were shot at different times in different places and actually combine them so that, as far as the viewer was concerned, it happened in the same space at the same time.
By rephotographing a number of layers of film onto a single print, the optical printer allowed the development of complex optical effects and composite shots. The greatest exponent of the optical printer was Linford Dunn, whose collaboration with Greg Toland and Orson Welles raised the integration of live action and models to new levels in Citizen Kane. This famous shot is a combination of crane movement, flyaway scenery, and optical effects. Welles' demands pushed the optical printer to its limits.
He used it like a paintbrush, and that was fine with me, except he was asking for things that I'd never done before, and they were not feasible, and they were not going to look good, such as a zoom on top of a zoom, and the quality would be bad. However, he had enough power at the studio to okay the money and the time it would take to do these things, and so I was happy to go ahead, and I learned a lot on it, and most everything he wanted came out all right. For example, even in the library where we have the gal sitting on the bench and the base of a statue that says Thatcher on her left. So he said when he was editing, well, I'd rather start up on the statue and just pan down and then back, just like it was there. And they said, well, there's no statue on the film.
You didn't have a statue on the set?
Oh, no, just the base of it. And so I had a statue made about 2 feet high. Well, I made a straight shot of that, and then on the optical printer, I made a motorized pan down from it, and then a pan from the scene of the girl, and then matched it with a traveling split screen.
Under which you may inspect certain portions of Mr. Thatcher's unpublished memoir.
And so many of the devotees of Citizen Kane couldn't believe that those things were done, and I could go on, like in the Opera House, Comingore singing on the stage, and the camera going up into the wings, and the two men up on the platform reacting to her singing. And Wells said, well, I want more travel, like we're going way, way up there. So we built a miniature and made a split screen and panned onto the miniature and then off to the miniature up to the scene above and fitted it in between.
Today, the basic techniques have changed little, although the advent of motion-controlled cameras has allowed a much greater sophistication and complexity of shots.
Go up on yours a little, slowly.
What we're attempting to do today is to make these shots really believable. You really want to see a close-up of the actors on the boat and then be able to see the whole boat at sea traveling at full speed. So to create that illusion, which is not really done to this degree before, we need to have an element, which is the actors on green screen, to place onto our miniature boat.
Filming the actors against a green screen allows them to be optically isolated from their background. A negative mat is also made and used to create a window in the background plate. The live action is then digitally inserted into the window to complete the shot.
I think that the director has to be really on his game when you're dealing with effects, because you've got to keep it alive for the actors. And sometimes the actors will be playing to a green screen, or they'll be in a situation which is so unreal for them compared to what it would really have been like. And on this film, what we've tried to do is put the actors in a real setting first before we do the effects, so they have some contact with the scene. So they've really been up 50 feet in the air on the bow of the ship in a strong wind next to the ocean, being able to look out and see the ocean horizon and all that. They feel like they've been on the ship. Now we put them in this green screen rig. They can recreate that through, you know, sense memory or whatever their process is. They know what they're doing.
For multiple element shots to be successful, all the separately filmed components must match perfectly.
I don't think you're standing on those things. I think you're standing on the ground.
Yeah, see, look, his feet are sticking out at ground level right underneath the railing. Well, the important thing is that his hips hit the railing at the right point.
Let me look, hang on. I think actually Leo might have been further back. Hang on a second.
What we're shooting right now is a matched move, and it's very intricate, matching a motion control shot we did of the boat, basically imitating like a space cam shot or helicopter shot that you would conventionally see in a film. Recreate that move with motion control, take that same motion control move, and now shoot the actors as an element to fit onto the boat. So when you see the entire composite, it looks like Jim built a full-size Titanic, set it out to sea, and got a West Cam and shot it, just the way he would do in a conventional movie.
Here we go, positions, guys. Ready, sir. Okay, here we go. Let's start the move. And action.
And all will be achieved without ship, crew, or actors ever getting anywhere near water, much less getting their feet wet.
Leo. Cut.
With all the components completed, they are combined digitally. The actors onto the model ship, the ship onto a digitally created ocean. And another 9 seconds of Cameron's film has been completed. Whether an effect succeeds or fails depends on how skillfully its creator is able to undermine our perception of the real world.
In interpreting the visual image, the brain has to resolve ambiguities. And in doing so, it uses all sorts of assumptions, built-in assumptions about the world. And because it uses all these assumptions, which we can investigate in the laboratory and discover, you can also trick the visual system. And this is what you call a visual illusion. This is the M's room. It's a grotesquely deformed trapezoidal room. But the astonishing thing is, if you look inside the room looks completely normal. And the walls look parallel and everything seems fine. The reason is that the brain has a built-in assumption that the walls of rooms are usually parallel. This is something we've grown up with all our lives. And this assumption is so strong that it completely overrides the fact that the people are actually changing sizes. Even though in the real world, obviously people don't change sizes like balloons, here you're willing to see that because the assumption of parallel walls is much stronger.
I think in the case of special effects, what's happened is that we've become increasingly sophisticated. So whilst it might have surprised people in the early days, and they would have been completely unaware about how particular visual effects are produced, we have got much more sophisticated, and therefore we are constantly on the lookout to see how we're being tricked, whether we're being tricked.
In June 1922, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created a furore among the Society of American Magicians that made the front page of the New York Times. Doyle took a test reel of The Lost World and presented it without comment to Harry Houdini, who was dedicated to exposing fraudulent spiritualists. The technique of three-dimensional model animation was virtually unknown at the time. Houdini and the Society were dumbfounded by what they saw. Doyle had apparently captured dinosaurs on film.
Oh, goodbye. Come along.
The man responsible for creating the dinosaurs was Willis O'Brien, whose masterpiece of stop-motion animation was released in 1933.
Come asame! Come! Come asame! Come asame! Come! Come asame! Come asame! Come! Come asame! He did dance a party. He spoke in times, but hardly. One woman heard his love call, but he was too big and too tall.
A model would be built and its articulations would be moved a tiny, tiny fraction of a space on each frame, and thus we could bring to life mythical creatures and so on. Now that ran from 1920 through till 1980 without much change.
The animation of King Kong took O'Brien a painstaking 55 weeks and the majority of the $650,000 budget to complete. But the film's success ensured that the technique would survive. The stop-motion animation successor to O'Brien was one of his protégés.
Probably the guy who brought most to it was Ray Harryhausen, who perfected the techniques. But even he could not make it appear totally believable. There was still always a gap between the stop-motion model, which was being lit in the foreground, and the other action in the scene, which was actually being rear-projected behind it. So that rear-projected image would be grainy and would be out of focus, whereas the model at the front would be incredibly well lit and totally pinpoint sharp focus too.
One million years later, and 5,000 miles away, there was the beginning of a revolution that would ultimately solve this problem. That revolution was computer graphics. The roots of virtually every aspect of today's computer graphic industry can be traced directly to pioneering research undertaken at Utah.
The first thing I tried to do was do an animation of my hand. This was a class project. I had always wanted to be an animator, so here was a place where I could combine technology and art and do animation and do science at the same time. It was just a great place to be, and it had a tremendous amount of fun. This kind of animation, this kind of learning had never been done before. So I wrote a paper on this, and it's the sort of thing that could get published at that time. You couldn't publish it now, of course. It was very clear to me and to a small number of other people that the 3D capabilities of the computer could change the way that we made films. But it was also very clear that the image quality was far too limited, and that in order for us to go to the next level, we had to incorporate in our group filmmakers. And it was our good fortune to find an animator who really wanted to do that, and it was John Lasseter.
When I saw the first computer animation I'd ever seen, which was during the making of Tron at Disney, it was like a little door in my mind opened up, and it was like, wow, this whole new world. And I immediately thought of how you could apply this technology to animation and make it much more dimensional.
4 effects studios worked at full capacity to produce 15 minutes of computer-generated imagery.
You could do Steadicam shots in animation, you know, follow characters in and around objects, which you couldn't have done with 2D painted backgrounds. And I thought the possibilities were endless. Special effects people, they were very, very excited by what they saw in Tron, and Tron still stands out to me and to many other people like me as a milestone in our history, because at last we saw not the actuality, but we saw the potential. Where there was a problem with Tron was that there was a huge differential between the expectation of the producers on the film and what computer graphics was actually able to deliver. And an awful lot, actually, of the effects in the film had to be done the old traditional way. The film failed to make its money. For whatever reason, it bombed, it didn't go anywhere. And I think that the reaction across the Hollywood filmmaking community was that they applauded Disney for taking the risk and going forward and trying new technology, but they decided that they were never going to get their fingers burned by using that technology. So fundamentally, computer graphics and film just went away and hid for about 8 or 9 years after that show.
Watch it, watch it.
At the time, I really was only thinking about the computer as a background, not as the character. And it wasn't until I came to work with Ed Catmull in the group at Lucasfilm, which was the prior incarnation of Pixar, where they challenged me to think about the characters being created with the computer.
Away from the spotlight of Hollywood, computer-generated imagery came of age.
It really started out as an exercise, and we were under tremendous technical limitations at the time as to, you know, we couldn't have any backgrounds. That's why the background of it is just basically black. There's no camera moves were allowed because we couldn't afford the rendering time. So all those kind of limitations that were imposed on me actually made it that much better, because what happened is that the audience is completely focused on the characters. And that's what I think Luxo Jr., what it did differently than any other computer animation that had been done before. That was the first time computer animation had really made that leap, and it was very exciting to me.
With computer animation almost perfected, all that was needed was for Hollywood to take note. In 1991, the wake-up call came in the shape of James Cameron's Terminator 2.
What really allowed Terminator 2 to come along was, first of all, the improvements in hardware and software, which we hadn't seen before, but also very much the ambitions of Jim Cameron, one man, who did not look at the technology and say, what can it do and how can it fit in, but actually made new demands on it and asked people to innovate and change. And he was responsible for a great, great move forward. And he was also responsible for the reviving of computer graphics in many ways in the motion picture industry.
We could do things that before they couldn't even dream of. It just changed the way they thought about effects, the way they thought about film production. And fundamentally, and at the very foundations, changed the way everything was done in Hollywood. And when a film is successful in this industry, everybody notices. So this was the time when everybody jumped on the bandwagon and started to put resources on it. For those who might have straggled behind when Jurassic Park came out, it clinched it for everything. It just, the world changed at that time, and they all knew it.
They're flocking this way.
Widely touted as a tour de force, there was one significant problem that needed to be resolved before the images would be convincing.
When it comes to computer graphics, everything was in perfect focus. And it's sort of like the original stop-motion animation of Harryhausen. I don't know if you remember those from when you were a kid, but you had these old dinosaur and these Sinbad movies, and they looked a little wrong. And the reason they looked wrong was because of this perfect focus. And normally you don't think about this, and it looks very natural. What makes it look natural is that real actors are blurred a little bit in the direction of motion. So the trick was, how do we get things focused or defocused in the direction of motion? And this is a very hard problem, but it's a problem that we solved. What we discovered was a way of putting the motion blur into our synthetic images so they were blurred just like the live actors were, and therefore you could mix them together. You would not even think about it because they look like they belong together, and you wouldn't have anything in your brain ringing alarm bells saying that something was wrong with the picture. When we did that, you could do such things as dinosaurs or silver robots and have people look at them and think that, wow, they're actually in the scene.
With two high-grossing effects films firmly under its belt, Hollywood was more than willing to embrace the new technology.
We had, 80 years of doing, moving puppets around with constraints on them that didn't allow us to fulfill a vision. The physical world was very difficult to manipulate around to make these images. And now with computer graphics, you can do just about anything you can imagine.
This newfound enthusiasm was not confined to the studio producers. Effects shots were continually added during production.
We were setting the shot up and we're doing it with a stunt girl. And I said to Stephen, we could do a face replacement on here because we can shoot a scene with the girl, the actress safely harnessed there, and then the stunt girl falling down, if we just have the girl's face showing briefly. So we shot it that way with the stunt girl falling down, raises her face up, puts her face down, and so she's looking right in the camera when she looks up. Then we got the real actress and just harnessed her there and had her raise her face up and down real quickly. And just did a little like cut and paste, like you can do on, word processor on a computer, though. We're doing it, with images. Jurassic Park at the beginning, we didn't even know if we could make these animals look right. I had never seen computer graphic hides, skins that had ever looked like real skins. They'd always looked, like plasticky. And to get the motions right is something that I'd never seen either in computer graphic work. So we had a lot of hurdles we had to solve. Once you start thinking of doing things digital and you're doing a dinosaur, it's not a big leap to think, hey, I could change from a real person to a digital person at some point, when the Tyrannosaurus picks up in the lawyer or on the toilet, something like that. So you can do just about anything. Now we're really into a refining. The work is getting better, but we're really learning how to use the tool now to create performances, not just to create objects that move around or dinosaurs that move or whatever, but to create things with much more character than we were doing before. So it's like, the Stradivarius was just invented. Now we're learning how to play it.
The unbridled optimism for what the computer could achieve resulted in an explosion in the computer graphics industry. 15 years ago, SIGGRAPH, the convention for the industry, attracted only a handful of graphics pioneers and academics. With prices of computers falling and power of processors rising, the industry is now a multi-billion-dollar business.
We're talking about exponential growth in the number of shots and, most importantly, in the complexity of each of those shots. And we're also talking about appropriate changes in allocations of budget. We can get anything up to 50% of a film's overall budget. In 1993, a film might have five-second shots in it, was a considerable film in terms of computer-generated imagery. The film that we've done most recently had 800 shots in it. Now, we're still talking about a film that runs for 90 minutes, but 800 shots, and each of those shots, in terms of complexity, is vastly more difficult than what we were doing 5 years ago.
The computer has revolutionized every aspect of the filmmaking process, and yet 90% of computer effects are designed never to be seen.
There are two types of effect. There's the visible effect, which carries the wow factor, which basically is in your face. It's the dinosaur in Jurassic Park, it's the alien in Aliens 4, it's something that's meant to terrify you, fascinate you, pull you in. You go and see it because you're really curious. Then there's the invisible effect. It adds a huge amount to the storytelling in the film, but in fact nobody knows that it was done digitally.
But the most radical innovation in this effects shot was Cameron's desire to populate the ship with 500 digital extras.
The brain is very good at extracting regularities from nature. And one of the most striking examples of this is our uncanny ability to extract biological motion, our ability to perceive biological motion. And a striking way of demonstrating this is to simply put spots of light, LEDs or luminous spots of light, on a person's joints and ask the person to walk in a completely dark room. If he's standing still, all you see is a bunch of spots. But as soon as he starts walking, he comes to life. And suddenly you see all the spots moving, and the brain extracts the regularities, and using the information about relative movement, it correctly deduces this must be a human being who's walking.
Our perception of movement is so refined that not only can we discern that these are two people, but that they are dancing badly. So producing digital extras that would be convincing was never going to be easy.
The nature of these characters, they have to be human beings. They have to look like they're alive, they're in the shot, they actually exist. And that's a very, very tall order to make that look real. So really the only tool that made sense was to use performance capture and the technology that goes along with that.
An array of 7 cameras film an actor from every angle.
Markers are on the joints, on the elbow, the wrist, knees, and ankle. And the computer can then assemble all these pictures together from each camera and triangulate the position of the joint.
The character is fleshed out, rendered, and a scanned photograph of a face is wrapped around the head. Then it is ready to be composited onto the boat.
The way that synthetic or digital characters are actually presented in films at the moment is interesting, because it's almost as a consequence of the problems that we still have making these characters believable. So they're slightly out of focus, they're in the back of shot, but we never get a chance. The filmmaker never gives us a chance to examine them close up. In the past, computer-generated imagery has helped to tell the story. Where animate objects have been computer-generated, they've been dinosaurs. They've not had to have any character attributes. You don't have to be interested in them. You have to be scared of them. And I think it's Toy Story that's seeded the idea of virtual actors, of computer-generated imagery that we actually relate to and care about.
I don't think there's one person that doesn't look at him and says, that guy's just realized something and he's starting to think.
And so that's so important to us, to get that feeling that character, at that moment, no one in the world is thinking how many bits of data Woody is. No one realizes how many hours those frames took to compute. They're thinking about the emotion. We're communicating those, the feelings of that character to the audience. And that is the foundation of everything we do at Pixar. It's the story and it's the characters.
Look, we're all very impressed with Andy's new toy.
Toy?
T-O-Y. Toy.
Excuse me, I think the word you're searching for is Space Ranger.
The word I'm searching for, I can't say because there's preschool toys present.
Getting kind of tense.
To me, there's one of the questions that I've often wondered is that the human being is probably the most difficult thing to create artificially. And the reason is that the audience, we view humans every single day. We look at them in the mirror. So we know exactly what they look like and how they move. So in order to get something that looks decent, it takes a tremendous amount of work, or else one little step and it won't look real. It'll be unbelievable to the audience.
At the University of Geneva, they're attempting to go beyond animation and create a character that lives entirely within the computer.
The big problem for photorealistic Marilyn is the movement. You can have the recording of movement using, the sensors, but this isn't good. But in our research, what we like to do is to have autonomous virtual humans.
Every behavioral attribute of the character must be correctly identified, calculated by computer algorithms and built into control systems within the software. This flowing ribbon alone took the computer 2 days to calculate and render.
Fabric is very difficult because you don't use sensors just to copy the reality. What you do is to give the model to the computer, mathematical or physical model. The computer has to know to every moment what are the wrinkles which are dynamically created. And if you have, for example, like this cotton thing like me, it can have several wrinkles. If you have other material, wool, for example, wrinkles will be different. If you move differently, you have various wrinkles, so you cannot decide in advance. The computer has to know it exactly at which frame by itself. So this is the reason why it's complicated.
I wanna be loved by you, just you, nobody else but you.
Convincing Fabric is the easy part.
The second thing, of course, is, the computer should know how to simulate skin. But today, nobody has done this. So we are still on the research process, and the results are 80%, but it's still missing 20%, so it doesn't look 100%.
I love you.
I love you too.
What we have discovered from various studies over the last few years is that there are particular areas in the brain which are actually devoted specifically to the processing of faces. So you can use a variety of techniques, from actually electrophysiological techniques or non-invasive techniques, imaging techniques like fMRI and PET scanning, which reveal different parts of the brain are operating when we're doing different sorts of tasks. And what's been discovered is that individual cells in those face areas are selective to particular attributes of faces.
The research has revealed unexpected subtlety. Different groups of face cells are actually stimulated by different expressions.
It turns out, for instance, that if we make a perfectly symmetrical, perfect face, that we think of it as being wrong. That it's only when we have a few asymmetries that we actually think of things as being natural. So we want things to be not quite perfect, have a lot of subtlety, but if they're too imperfect, then we think that they're strange. If you work with a caricature of a human face, then you can actually get away with quite a bit. But the closer you get to a real face, the more our internal mechanisms start to kick in and say that things are wrong.
So how will we be able to create a realistic digital face? I think my best guess would be to say that we need to understand more about the human visual system. If we can learn about the ways in which we perceive faces and all the subtleties and the complexity of faces and be able to reproduce them in a digital way, then we might succeed.
So can we really expect a convincing computer-generated actor on our screens soon?
There's a huge amount of interest in it from the studio's point of view. Because instead of blowing $20 million on above-the-line talent, such as Sylvester Stallone, and then paying him all the residual payments afterwards, they can actually go ahead, they can produce their own figure, who has the body shape of the day, who has the head that everybody loves. They can reproduce him in plastic without paying royalties. There's a huge raft of reasons why I think that virtual actors are going to be appearing on our screens quite soon. Not yet totally believably, but that's still to come.
If you could create in the computer Marilyn Monroe or John Wayne or Elvis Presley and make them look exactly like, you know, they did, who's going to make them act? That's the fundamental thing that people tend to forget about this. Is this, you know, Humphrey Bogart is not a legend because of the way he looked. It's the way he acted.
See you later.
There are a lot of Elvis impersonators, but the fact is, they're not the real thing. Now, some of them actually do an extraordinary job, but we know the difference. And so the fact that you might come in and impersonate a person at some point will probably be technically feasible, but it's not a very interesting thing to do any more than an Elvis impersonator is a terribly interesting person.